Everything started on a fateful day, when Luke was about to receive his gift just like every other person in his village did once they attained the right age. His dad was proud because he strongly believed that his son would awaken as a battle lord. Currently, the royal family had lost its power, leading to frequent territorial clashes, so Luke, being the son of a lord, was expected to receive a gift suited for combat like his father. Even better for Luke, his mother was a swordsman, while his father was a holy swordsman of a higher rank who earned the title of a marquis. So naturally, he expected the same from his son, and Luke was sure he wouldn't let his father down. As Luke stood to receive his blessing with his stepbrother, the villagers expected that he'd awaken an extraordinary gift, so everyone watched in anticipation while the priest motioned for them to be silent. Quite oddly, he announced that Luke was blessed with the gift of village building. The boy was dismayed and surprised, so he asked what sort of gift that was, and the priest said it was certainly not a gift that was useful in combat. It felt like Luke's world had come crashing down, and the villagers had now lost all sense of hope, even when Luke's stepbrother, Raoul, rudely shoved him aside to receive his own blessing. Much surprisingly, the priest announced that Raoul was blessed with the gift of holy swordsmanship. This made the villagers quite elated, while Luke's dad and glorified baby mama hugged their son proudly. On the other hand, Luke and his disappointed mom were completely ignored. The next scene showed Luke leaving the town, but none of his parents came to see him off, so he got in a cart and headed north toward some uninhibited wilderness that belonged to the family. It so happened that Luke was tasked with developing that uninhabited area, and it was his narcissistic brother's idea, who just wanted him to be exiled. No one could oppose him because Luke's gift was more worthless than memecoins, but Raoul was the agile warrior they all needed. Besides, Luke had never been the fighting type, and even though his family was a long line of warriors, he just wanted to be a soft boy with a trust fund and a harem. Soon, the cart stopped at the supposed place, and Luke was even more disappointed when he saw the state of the land. Even worse, it was in between a deadly forest and a mountain, which were both said to be teeming with monsters. He dragged his luggage and wondered how he was supposed to survive in such a place all by himself. However, he suddenly saw his maid, Milia, encouraging him not to despair and praising him for maintaining a positive attitude despite everything. He asked her if she was sure about staying with him, and she said she couldn't spend a day without his cream sauce and that she was willing to serve him loyally until the very end. While Luke was glad to see that there was still someone who loved him so much, Milia's loyalty was that strong because she was an obsessed Shodakan. Anyway, she shared that he only had two options, the first being to survive in the barren land, although they were running low on unlimited supplies, while the second option was to elope with her to a brand new city. It was obvious that Milia preferred the second option, and frankly, that was the most feasible option they had, so Luke was about to consider it too. But he was curious about his village building power because he had not used it ever since he was blessed with it. He randomly clenched his fist, but suddenly a holographic screen appeared and startled him, while Milia, who couldn't see the screen, suspected that he knew her lewd fantasies. The screen popped a message, but when Milia blinded him with her water balloons, Luke couldn't see what was written and had to tell her to back off. The message read that their current location was great for a new village creation, but it was written in a foreign language, and Luke wondered just how he could recognize the letters. It wasn't surprising because he always had memories of a past life he couldn't explain, which made him feel odd and was probably related to his gift. Although he wasn't sure about his decision, Luke agreed to create the village, and right before them, a magical occurrence happened, and the ground spontaneously leveled itself. On the stat window, Luke was at level 1 and had 50 points in his village. But there was a list of things he could choose to build, and even though Luke didn't really understand these things, there was no harm in trying, so he chose to build a small hut. That required just 10 points from him, and the moment he clicked yes, a hut suddenly appeared in front of them, much to Milia's surprise. With a daily refresh point of 10 points and only 40 points left, Luke wondered if he should build another small hut, but Milia suggested that they both manage the tiny hut and instead build a well because water was the top priority for them. Again, Luke did the impossible, and a modified well appeared out of nowhere. He tried to take off the lid, but found out that he only needed to use the lever to get some water, and this was a lot better than the manual method of obtaining water in his father's castle. This left him with only 10 points, and Milia said he should build a field next, but the status window popped up and asked if he would like to turn Milia into a villager. With her permission, he did so and got an extra point, and for every new villager he added, the system would award him with 1 point every day. For now, they didn't need any more villages, and Milia had to make sure he knew she was the only one who could seize his breath with her airbags. As they retired for the night, Luke accepted his gift as a blessing in disguise because he would never have wanted to live in a world where all he did was shed blood. He had finally decided that he would use his new life to create his own village and make it so peaceful to suit his personality. While he was dreaming and oozing hot sauce from his sausage, Milia couldn't have enough of him and wished he could share all that with her. The next day, a young lady named Celen decided to leave her father's home, but he questioned her reason, and it was simply that she had endured enough of Raoul's madness. She preferred it when she was engaged to Luke, but Raoul was too much for her to handle because he was always downing 10 packs of Viagra and tearing her fish pie. However, her father reminded her that they needed the marriage for some dumb political reasons, but Celen would rather die a nun than get married to that rabid stallion. The guards tried stopping her, but one fierce look from her was enough to make them question their manhoods. Eventually, she had her way and shut the door right behind her. On the other hand, Milia was enjoying a night of getting bulldozed by Luke, and she later got up earlier because she felt obligated to do so as his maid. But he told her not to because she was now a villager and no longer his maid. To that, she said she was going to support him to the best of her ability, and her mind traveled back to the day she first arrived at the castle, when she was younger. She was also of noble birth, but from a low-ranking family, and the only option available to her kind was to marry or serve as a maid in a higher-ranking noble family. Moving into the Albert family, Milia struggled to adapt, and on an unfortunate day, she accidentally broke Luke's mother's favorite dish, so the woman scolded her mercilessly until Luke stepped in and took the blame for the broken dish. This calmed his mother, but she still somehow blamed Milia for it, although the maid was actually surprised that Luke took the fall for her mistake. When his mom left, Luke explained that he deliberately did what he did because he knew she'd be a lot easier on him than on Milia. It was in that moment that Milia saw a true Sigma who had won her heart, and she'd sworn to serve him loyally. Back to the present day, Luke had accumulated up to 20 points, which was enough to create a field, and he planned to toil the soil with his own hands, even though Milia felt he was too noble for such dirty work. Watching him work the soil made her wish that he could work her wet rose garden with those strong hands. At the end of the day, Luke took a long, refreshing bath, and a bathroom idea suddenly popped into his head. Since they hadn't experienced any monster attacks, Luke thought to create something to serve as a defense, so he later created a watchtower. As days went by, Luke achieved more feats and even created a wall, while their field started sprouting. But suddenly, a loud sound occurred and Milia quickly ran to check it out at the watchtower. While she ascended the tower, it occurred to her that she didn't think before climbing, and Luke could probably see that she borrowed her grandmother's sagging underwear. But she found that he wasn't even looking, and then she saw that a horde of goblins were headed their way. Initially, they couldn't get over the wall until they began to use themselves as ladders to go over it. This left Luke with no option but to fight, so he told Milia to stay back while he took up a sword, glad for all the years of training he invested in it. One of the goblins rushed to attack him, but Luke was swift to block his attack with his sword, and even sliced the ugly thing into equal halves. More and more of them kept coming for him, but Luke didn't stop fighting. However, one goblin took him by surprise, and the moment it approached him, something out of the blue stoned its ugly skull. Luke looked at the wall and found that it was Celen, standing on the fence. Known as the Ice Princess, Celen was Luke's fiancée who possessed dual-wielding and livened magic, allowing her to fight with 2 blades and use water and ice magic. Seeing her in the wilderness all of a sudden, Luke asked Celen why she was there, but she tried to change the topic. He insisted on the question, and she eventually shared that she ran away from home, cut ties with everyone, and broke off her engagement to Raoul. Again, she shared that being a virgin until she was 90 was a better choice than getting married to that scoundrel. All the while, Luke never noticed that she'd been against the marriage until now, so he apologized to her for the lack of freedom she experienced when it came to getting married. However, she told him that marriage was not the problem, and it was just Raoul. But if she had gotten married to Luke, she'd have liked it. Just then, Milia came in to separate whatever mushiness was going on and warned that they shouldn't have private talks. She introduced herself as the first villager and Luke as the village head. So Celen asked how the heck they had a hut, a wall, and a well already because it was impossible to accept that they did it all by themselves. Instead of explaining, Luke moved to demonstrate exactly how it all happened, and so he created a storehouse that appeared out of the blue. Celen was surprised, and when Luke told her the other thugs he could create with his gift, She was really amazed that such a skill existed. At least that explained why he seemed to have covered much in a very short time. The system instantly asked if he would turn Celen into a villager, but he couldn't think of forcing her to live in such a whack place. He also pointed out that his family may not stay quiet about the whole engagement thing because it was supposed to ally his much more powerful family with her seemingly weaker one. However, she said the Alberts won't waste time getting pissed at her family, and her family, on the other hand, won't survive making more enemies. She didn't care though, because she was supposed to get married to Luke anyway, and since her brother awakened a powerful skill, her family would be fine. Much surprisingly, Celen mentioned that she could hang in his village for a bit. But Luke wasn't prepared for that, and the moment she said she had nowhere else to go, the system automatically accepted her as a villager, increasing his daily points to 12 points. He brought her to realize that he didn't have any proper food, and with her gift, she was sure to find better places to live. But she misunderstood him to be implying that her existence was a burden to him. But the even more important issue was that those two ladies were glaring at each other like two territorial lionesses and began arguing. Milia said the village wasn't a nice place for prim and proper trust fund babies, but Celen shaded her, saying at least she had skills that could protect Luke, unlike Milia, who graduated Janitor Academy with honors. The maid, however, said she was the first villager, which made her the senior in that case, but Celen mocked her failed attempt at exerting dominance over her. This resorted to Milia mocking Celen's chest fruits and saying they reminded her of peanuts, but Celen wasn't having this and claimed she was a B-cup. So Milia had even more fun and said there was more hope for an old raggedy grandma to grow succulent melons than there was for Celen. At a point, Luke just had to walk away to protect his peace from these women, but a few moments later, Celen barged in on Milia, massaging Luke with her natural pillows, and she was mad that they'd been sleeping in such a cramped space. But Milia simply asked if she had a problem with that and started pushing her out of the room since she was trying to be silly. To quell things down, Luke suggested that he'd probably sleep in the storehouse, but the ladies weren't having it and didn't agree to it, although Celen implied that Milia naturally belonged to the storehouse. This was suggestive of the fact that she just wanted to get raw and dirty with Luke that night, so Milia called her out and started another fight, leading to Luke finalizing that he was going to stay in the warehouse. Eventually, they convinced him to lie sandwiched between them while they took him on a mental ride to the land of ecstasy. Briefly, let's see things from Celen's point of view. On her first visit to the Albert Castle, her father advised her to act properly because Luke was likely to become her husband someday, but she really didn't understand what was going on. Her father briefly excused himself, and she suddenly saw a stone land right next to her feet. She traced the direction from where it came and saw some boy playing in the fields, which she thought was probably Luke. However, she later saw another boy tied up to a tree and Raoul kept throwing stones at him, aiming this time around his face. But Celen quickly jumped in and asked him what the hoot he thought he was about to do. Raoul claimed that he was only having fun, but she tried stopping him from throwing and potentially giving the boy a fatal wound. The psychopath said he didn't care if the boy died, because he could simply get others to have fun with, so he eventually had his way with the stone. Unfortunately, the stone landed on Luke's head, so Celen asked if he was alright, and they both untied the boy from the tree. Raoul immediately ran off and said he wasn't really aiming for Luke, but Celen couldn't get the guy's deal. It was much later that she learned that the young Ted Bundy-looking dude was Luke's stepbrother, and she was glad that wasn't the Luke she was looking for. Years later, they met again, and Celen asked if Luke ever brought up what Raoul did to him, because it was a big deal that the concubine's son hurt the legal son. But Luke was trying to protect his brother's already damaged reputation, and even though Celen wished he taught the rowdy dude a lesson, Luke was only watching out for his brother, who already had to deal with people's negative comments about him being his father's baby mama's son. Hearing him speak again like that made Celen feel so lucky that the kind and considerate Luke was her fiancé. Currently, Luke was glad to have accumulated up to 54 points, because that meant he could build a big house and prevent a potential World War III between his main chick and the side chick. He eventually got to the house, and they were surprised to see that there was furniture there, and there was a glass cooker in the kitchen too, which Celen thought to be some magical instrument. The running water from the tap also intrigued them, and Luke explains that the so-called magical instrument was a cooking stove using gas, after which he went on to demonstrate by turning on the ignition. This was great news for Helen because at least she could cook easily for her baby daddy. He also took them to the bathroom and showed them that what they thought was a chair was actually a toilet that could flush and all. Celen asked whether the sewage would end up because on a castle, the servants were usually tasked with collecting the sewage. Anyway, they felt the gods would deal with that themselves, and Celen was only glad they no longer had to use the well outside. For Luke, the biggest thing was that they now had 2 separate bedrooms, but this felt like the beginning of the biggest fight about to be witnessed, because neither of the ladies was willing to share a bedroom with the other. Eventually, he had to agree that they'd sleep in the same room, although his initial plan was to sleep on the floor and have the ladies take the bed. However, it was out of his control and both ladies would rather remain sandwiched to him. A month had passed since Luke relocated to a barren land, and he'd been grateful for just how far he'd come already. One morning, Celen had just hunted a wild boar for them from the forest up north, but Luke felt this was risky behavior and warned her against it. She was really hungry for some meat and already had a means to preserve it with her magic. With another thing to brag about against Milia, Celen smiled scornfully because she felt more useful than Milia. But the maid wasn't having it because she was the only one preparing all their meals while Celen sat on her high horse, thinking she was Elon Musk's 30th child. Right then they both aggressively started chopping the meat until Celen overheard voices approaching them. They climbed the watchtower to confirm and saw there was indeed a group of people outside the fence. However, these didn't seem to be harmful people because they looked hungry and worn out and were probably refugees from a recent battle. Luke couldn't bear to ignore these helpless folks, so he walked up and found out that they didn't even know there was a village on the way. He introduced himself and the head and founder of the village, while the leader of the other group introduced himself as Burlet. These dudes all looked so pathetic that Luke was moved, so he led them to his well and told them to drink as much water as they wanted. They were glad, but didn't know how exactly to get water out of the well, so he demonstrated how to use the pump, making them all amazed at that technological advancement. This made Luke decide to make another awl, and he told them to feel free to use out as they wanted. And after they drank enough water, Burlet shared that they left their village behind and most of the men were drafted, while the older folks stayed behind, including his old father. Until now, they'd been wandering pointlessly and were down to their last bits of food and water, had they not found Luke's village. Luke said they didn't have enough food because they were yet to harvest their crops, but he shared some of his meat with them, and they were so glad to eat that they were moved to tears. Burlet watched his wife and offspring eating, and was so glad that he broke down crying, asking how he could ever repay Luke for his kindness. But he was quite worried about them because they had more hardship to encounter in the future, and it'd be impossible for them to survive in the wasteland. He enthusiastically asked Burlet if he'd like to live there because they were short-handed on people to help till the soil. But Burlet said his group was mostly composed of women and children, so they'd be a handful to feed and wouldn't be a reliable source of labor. Still, Luke truthfully confessed that the 3 of them had been relying on stored grains they'd taken from the castle and didn't have the slightest idea how to make it on their own, so he wanted Burlet to help them. Tearfully, he agreed, and almost immediately, the system welcomed all 51 of the Burlet caravan as villagers. This took Luke to village level 2 and gave him 100 bonus points, in addition to another facility. He was scared, but before he knew it, he'd leveled up to village level 3 and had 764 village points and would be getting 83 points daily. Now, he had 2 additional skills named Assess Villager and Move Facility. Luke understood the whole getting points for leveling up his village and all that, but he didn't really understand what these skills meant. He activated the Move Facility feature and saw that his house had moved, much to his excited surprise. While he was celebrating his new skill, Burlet was trembling as he reported that the buildings were moving. He felt he was seeing things and had lost his mind from the exhaustion, so he passed out and Luke had to explain to Burlet's wife that it was his gift. She was thrilled that he had a gift, and the younger ones around also wanted to see what a gift was because it was strange to them. He told them he had the gift of village building, but no one wanted to be the dirty sweaty mason with really nice abs when they could just be Batman. Luke later decided to make better houses for the villagers and selected a row house with 5 living spaces, each space having 2 bedrooms and 1 toilet. Such a space would be enough for a family of 5, but these houses, unfortunately, didn't have baths, so he told them they'd have to make do with the wells since the system gave him no option of baths. Seeing that each row house could accommodate 25 people and only cost 80 points, he went on to create more row houses and expand the crops. Burlet thanked him for his handwork, so Luke decided to rest for the day. The new villagers all seemed like nice people, and Luke decided to use the villagers' assessing skill, which showed him someone's skill, his high level of loyalty towards the village, and that he had a gift of swordsmanship. Suddenly Luke felt guilty because the system had shown him how long and fat Barlat's shaft was. But he surely got curious about the gift part and asked the man what his gift was. He innocently answered that there was no church nearby to bless him with his gift, and he didn't feel talented enough to get one. Luke wondered if the guy would actually get the gift of swordsmanship if he'd been blessed in a church, so later he discussed it with Celen and Milia. They were mostly surprised that he possessed the ability to see a villager's potential gift, even if they currently knew nothing about it. He tried the feature on Celen and got her accurate readings, including the fact that her recommended job was to be a general. But she was curious about the village loyalty parameter because hers was high. He explained that if villagers had a low village loyalty score, they were more likely to be rebellious and commit crimes, so he'd be careful with those people. Hearing this, Celen advised that they screen everyone in the village since they needed their manpower, but Luke was worried that there would be some people who wouldn't want the assessment. Celen advised that he didn't have to tell them anything about the assessment he was doing, and that he should just ask them questions from what he saw on their assessment window to see if they'd lie or tell the truth. He agreed to do that, but Celen suggested that Milia could also get checked. However, the maid wasn't confident enough to try because she thought the system would reveal the wicked things she'd planned to do to Luke's body. So she ran off and said he was too young to see those things, so she'd go cool off. Later, Luke met Burlet and asked for his name and other stuff, so he volunteered truthful information, and even introduced Luke to his younger brother, who was Barlat. He also introduced a couple more, including his little ones and an old Karen, so Luke got the statistics of everyone there and even stumbled across some rare talents, including an apothecary, a maze explorer, a wordsmith, and a rubric magician. Later, Celen asked him how the exercise went and was thrilled to find that he'd found a great deal of talented magicians, but the issue was that only an oracle or the church could bestow such blessings upon anyone. This made Luke sad because he grew up hearing that only nobles usually got blessings of gifts, but in his village, he saw these commoners with numerous gifts, and it only means they were being lied to all along. Actually, one had to give a huge donation to the church to get blessed with gifts. But that was all just a lie created by the nobles and the church to restrict the distribution of blessings. Just then, Milia approached him and suddenly turned a bucket of water on her head to keep her mind in a blank state. She suddenly ripped her shirt open and told him to inspect every inch of her cannonballs, but Luke told her to hold that thought for later that night. Before he got ready to use his assessment skill on her, he and Celen felt she'd be recommended for a maid position, so Celen told him to read her stats out loud. The status window showed that her village loyalty was at an ultimate level, but even more surprisingly, it showed that she was recommended for the job of a priestess because she possessed the gift of an oracle. It was great news that Milia had a potential oracle gift, but even to activate it, they would have to get a priest. Otherwise, her blessing would remain dormant. Luke knew of people who got their gifts after praying in church, but his current village didn't even have one in the first place. Interrupting his thoughts, Berlin shared that the vegetables Luke had planted earlier were ready to be harvested and had grown really big. This must have been because the soil was a really good one and the system gave him an option to select a great field for that. By sunset, they'd harvested a load of products, and they were looking juicy, so Luke decided to host a welcome party for the villagers. Milia got coming, but Luke and Celen joined in to help her, so she was really glad that despite his status, the young guy was still eager to help. However, she almost immediately regretted her decision because he was supposed to be slicing some vegetables but found a way to unleash his inner assassin. She quickly jumped in and asked him to wash the veggies instead, but Celen bragged about being so good with a knife better than she was with her tongue, terrifying them both. Eventually, dinner was ready and the villagers came in to eat, glad because they'd never had such a grand feast. They looked for Luke and asked him to open the feats with a toast, after which they all dug into Milia's warm, juicy dish and were blown away by how delicious she tasted. While the men enjoyed the meal, they appreciated Luke's gift, which had created such advanced kitchen equipment that helped create a delicious meal. But just then, some villagers ran in and informed Luke that a group of people were approaching the village. They went to check things out at the tower and found out that they were refused, so Berlin recognized a guy he called Donga and soon went to welcome him. Luke asked if he knew the guy, and Burlet shared how he and Donga were long-term friends because Donga liked doing things to Burlet's sister. The guy shared that they were forced to leave their village too because of the war, and he was glad that Burlet had settled in such a place, making him their savior. However, Burlet said Luke was the village head and founder, so Donga was surpassed but still went on to greet Luke and introduce himself as the leader of their group. Luke said they could discuss more later, but for now, Donga and his people could join the party and feast with them. Some days later, Donga's people were all looking refreshed and robust, while he and Burlet were busy harvesting each other from the back. Luke was glad to see that they'd all made a full recovery, and by then, Donga decided to settle his people in Luke's village because it felt like heaven. They were 44 in number, so the total number of bushes was up to 97. So Luke increased the number of houses in farmland, did a census of their population, and discovered a few more talents among Donga's people. Just then, someone from the watchtower shared that there was a group of possible refugees inside the gates, but this time around, they were about 70 in number. This changed the boy's countenance because that figure seemed overwhelming, unlike when Burlet and his group joined them. Currently, the village already had 97 people, and adding more would be easy, but that meant Luke had to deal with more responsibility, and one wrong move could put everyone's lives in jeopardy. While he was lost in thought, Celen shared that they didn't have enough room to occupy the refugees. The village was already saturated, and it'd be like giving them false hope. So even though Luke possessed a powerful gift, it'd be great if he could limit how many people he welcomed in before the figure became too much. Also, not every refugee group would be as cooperative as the previous two they'd welcomed, so she decided to go speak to the dude, and Burlet and Donga supported the idea. They joined her despite Luke's protests and said it was a job for grown-ups to handle. To reassure him, Milia gently placed her hand on him to reassure him that she was there to support whatever decision he made. She also reprimanded Celen for using a harsh choice of words, and even though Luke understood what Celen was saying, he still couldn't find himself turning his back on anyone. He apologized for what he was about to do and told them to support him in case things went wrong. They all reassured him of their solidarity, and much later, he welcomed the Leon caravan as villagers, adding a total of 76 new members. This boosted Luke to level 4 and gave him 1,000 bonus points, extra village space, and a new skill called Facility Upgrade. Next, he rearranged the buildings and added new row houses and wells, and each time the village leveled up, the land area more than doubled. One of the best features that was added was a church, and he felt there was huge potential in building a church because the people would have blessings bestowed upon them. He decided to build one, and a nice church appeared, which immediately drew Milia's attention. As she walked in, she felt a strong pull towards the church, and when she walked in, there was an even more powerful pull that guided her up to a certain point. Luke knew she'd get her blessing in no time because those who had stronger faith were more likely to receive their blessings. She saw this as her opportunity to serve Luke, so she decided to pray all morning and evening. True to her words, Milia didn't stop begging God to make her melons bigger for Luke's sake, so he just left her behind and went to implement some nice upgrades in his storehouse. He also improved the growth speed of crops on his farm, the quality of products, and the time for harvest to increase village space. These changes went on, but a few days passed, and Luke remembered that he left Milia praying all by herself in the church, so he started to wonder if she was okay. But when he looked at her, something struck him differently. When she noticed his presence, Milia answered and ran to hug him as she excitedly shared that she'd gotten the oracle gift. Luke was so surprised, so he checked the assessment window and found that it was true, so Milia thanked him for providing the church and helping her get the gift without needing a priest. However, she soon drew him into her bouncy bosom and squeezed the last ounce of purity out of him, while Celen wondered why on earth the gods would choose such a lady to be a priest. Later, Luke gathered everyone around to share that they possessed the potential to receive gifts. One of the men said he was pretty sure gifts were only made for nobles, so a bloody farmer such as himself couldn't receive any. However, Luke said he may be right to say a few families were more opportune to get them, but his village assessment skill showed him otherwise. Even though they struggled to believe his words, Luke told them to step up and receive their gifts, so Barlat did, and Milia blessed him, saying he'd received the gift of swordsmanship. He suddenly experienced a sensation he couldn't understand, and the others watching him decided to confirm if he really received a gift, so they made him a makeshift sword out of wood. But Luke handed him a real sword he felt would be more useful in Barlat's hands, so the guy graciously received it even though he'd never held a sword before. But indeed it felt like he was supposed to. Even though he felt a bit old, he promised to protect the village with everything he had in him. This inspired everyone else to try out, so Luke discovered more gifted folks, including an apothecary, a maze explorer, a wordsmith, a pro farmer, a spearman, a swordsman, a danger sensor, a master sniffer of stinky pits, a shield man, and poison-resistant person. They were all amazed at their individual and collective gifts, and about 17 of them in total were blessed with gifts, 4 of which were younger ones. With that, Luke felt he could now provide his villagers with improved supply and defense. The swordsmen were already sharp at work, even though they'd never used swords before, reflecting the importance of retaining gifts and explaining why Luke's father wanted his sons to receive holy swordsmanship skills. The feisty Celen was their trainer, and she remarked on their improvement, adding that she'd take the swordsmen out hunting with her next time. Luke felt the whole teacher title they gave her was unnecessary because she was practically his mate, but Barlat said Celen had proved to be so powerful. Some other ladies said being a village head was even cooler, and they all started flooding him with love and cuddles you wish you had. As Luke recovered from being used as a teddy, he noted how there were twice as many women as there were men in the village. Most of the young ladies were married, but their husbands were forcefully conscripted into the army, so seeing them smile made Luke really happy, and Barlat came to thank him, especially for making them all happy. Later on from the watchtower, someone reported that there were about 10 more refugees, but they looked so traumatized and terrified. Luke asked for their story, and they shared that they were attacked by a band of thieves, who also got rid of a couple members while taking another group as hostages. Luke felt sympathy for them, but Celen pointed out that these terrified refugees had brought the problem to them. They began crying and apologizing profusely because the thieves were chasing them, so they were certainly on their way to Luke's village. The story switched to a different perspective, specifically that of a member of the gang of thieves named Bar. He was walking dejectedly because he let his guard down a bit and got the boss angry. His main job was to abduct refugees and sell them to slave traders, but due to his carelessness, some of them escaped, so he was tasked with bringing them back by himself. However, he encountered Luke's village and noticed there were mainly women and their offspring, meaning he'd hit the jackpot, and even more so if the villagers were mostly refugees that he could easily take down. Just then, his gang members communicated with him via telepathy, a gift bestowed upon one of the members that allowed them to communicate with each other from any distance. He told them that many lives were going to be ruined in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, Luke got a sudden hunch that something was not right, so he told Celen and was coincidentally alerted by the hologram that there was an intruder. Celen suspected that it could be the gang of thieves from earlier and was glad for Luke's system because it could save them from trouble. Anyway, the system message said there was just one intruder, so it means the person was scouting the village and had been located in the field. Celen was on standby along with the other combative voyagers, hiding in strategic places, but they noticed that the intruder was moving in silence, so Celen told Luke to stand back in case the intruder jumped out of nowhere. Luke checked his system map and pointed out where their intruder was hiding. Bar was very upset that he'd been caught, but when he found that it was just 2 dumb Gen Alphas who would be pretty easy to deal with. He dragged his sword and was ready to attack, but he was frozen in a big block of ice, which was something he didn't see coming. His gang members tried reaching out to him, but he couldn't respond, and just when Bar was locked in a cell, his members said they were heading to the village. When he regained consciousness, Celen went to check on him, but he was just finding it hard to understand how the heck he was in that cell in the first place. She asked him how many more of the gang members there were, but Bar wasn't ready to be a snitch at any point. His members asked him to answer if he could gear, and Bar eventually communicated back telepathically, saying they could certainly get in the village because there weren't many men to deal with. He said this in the hopes that the gang boss would show up and fix everything. But suddenly, one ancient baddie showed up and said she'd take care of the intruder. Luke was confused at first, but then he remembered that this granny had a PhD in tormenting people, and so when asked them to open the prison door for her, they let her in and only warned her not to get too close to him. Out of the blue, Granny asked Bar if he had a mother and that he should imagine his mother's face and think of all the pain she went through to bring his sorry buns to the world. He felt she was only doing this to make him cry, so he burst into a mock cry, saying he won't be bad anymore and they should let him go. Granny looked like she was buying out, but Celen told her not to be fooled because everything was just an act. But suddenly the dude was suspended in the air and Grandma was squeezing the milk out of his baby jewels until he was completely out of his senses when she started telling him to imagine just how sad his mom would look after she was done dealing with him. This sent chills down Luke's spine, so she told both of them to get ready for battle, while she tried to force him to talk. At the same time, Bar's gang members had just arrived at the village he directed them to. The telepathy guy said there was something off about Bar's replies because the conversations kept breaking, but the other guy felt he was just slacking as usual. Anyway, they decided to listen in on the village before raiding it. but their boss told them to shut up because all they needed were balls of steel to make the villagers squirt blood. He spotted the tiny gate and said they couldn't be stopped just because of the gate, so he swung his axe and broke the gate, after which he commanded his men to follow him. But instantly, Luke felt their presence approaching from the darkness, and the system pointed him to their location. On the other hand, the gangsters were worried that no one was screaming even though they'd broken in, but they weren't aware that Luke was about to create a water moat right under them. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way and the guys fell right into a body of water, and before they knew it, they were getting covered in ice from the bottom up. Celen was glad their plan worked and the bandits fell for their trap, while the other villagers who were in on it joined her to celebrate. They left, but the bandit leader suddenly spoke up from behind her, pointing out that she was the one who froze the water. She quickly spun and hit the man on his head, but it only made a clanging sound against his head. Luke was worried for Celen, who realized that the man was pretty strong since he was able to get himself out of the ice. The leader tried to attack her, but she dodged it and backflipped, but managed to land a cut on his sides. Watching this, the villagers noticed that the man was an equal match for Celen, but even worse, he noticed that the ice was melting because Celen was unable to focus on her magic. He ordered them to round the bandits up in good time, but surprisingly, one of them reached out to his limbs, and it was already too late. As the attackers plunged towards Luke, he knew it was already his last day on Earth, but a hand suddenly snatched him from impending death, belonging to none other than Barlat. But right before he could finish thanking him, he saw Barlat trying to use his sword with better aim than how you position your pee-pee in the toilet bowl. Luke was dizzy as heck, but he was back to his senses the moment he saw the combat villagers frozen in place. The thugs also noticed this and found that they didn't know how to use the weapons in their hands, so they proceeded to attack regardless, while Luke watched as his villagers were about to be wiped out, and they weren't even helping matters. One of them had to step in, so he called his frozen members to order, saying they should do exactly as they practiced on the training grounds. But they said they'd never fought this many opponents at once, so it was exactly what the opening needed to hear as they watched them getting hysterical. He thought victory was only inches away from him, but got kicked in the face, thanks to Luke being a weapon of destruction. He also instructed his villages to push those idiots back into the mood, and the other villages noticed that the thugs were actually still frozen, and their movements were pretty slow, meaning they could defeat them. With renewed courage, they began beating the life out of those fools as they found out that they were just weak guys with fat mouths. Each villager individually had to give themselves some pep talk to remind themselves of how much they had been through and that all they needed to do was focus. This resulted in them successfully getting lots of the thugs back into the moat, and the telepathy guy couldn't believe his eyes because those weak, miserable-looking novices were suddenly stronger than they could comprehend. Right before his own eyes, the boss fell into the moat and was in a completely frozen state, so they knew it was all over for them. This was all thanks to Celen's slick tactic because she had been taking out of his body heat with every single cut. She landed on him so he didn't notice that he was getting frozen little by little. At the end of the day, the villages won, and the system notified that 40 intruders were captured. The next day, the villagers rescued the other hostages who had been captured by the thieves, reuniting them with their loved ones. This was a team effort, but mostly Jeffrey Dahmer's mom, with her extreme torturing techniques, was able to successfully extract information from them. Right now, the only issue was they didn't know exactly how to deal with those captured bandits. Even worse, if Luke accidentally got captured by the prisoners, he'd be rammed so hard that he'd have to wear diapers for life. Normally, he would have turned them in to the nearest police station, but with the recent battles going on, no one would accept them, so he was essentially stuck with them. The dumb system suggested that he turn them into villagers, but there was no way on Earth he was going to do that. However, suddenly, it occurred to him that there was an option for a rehabilitation center, and he could try to reform some of them in the rehab. It also occurred to him that the title of the villager didn't particularly mean that they had to get equal treatment with the rest of the villagers. Moreover, if they became inhabitants, it meant he could use his villager assessment skill to determine their loyalty and know just how well the rehabilitation was working on them. He decided to get advice from the other villagers, but some of them who were badly traumatized were even disappointed that he wasn't kissing the bandits' skulls with bullets. Some felt getting rid of all the bandits was the safest option, but some others considered that not all the bandits were involved in murdering victims and might have been coerced to join them. In the end, Burlet and Duggan agreed that there could be future crimes, and so the best option was to see what the rehab center would do. However, one of the traumatized victims whose family was murdered by the bandits wasn't happy with this decision, and so she and a few others left the village. Luke felt bad for them, but Granny said they disagreed with the village's direction, and there was no helping that. She also told Luke that one day the villagers would forget everything he did for them, and go berserk as expected of humans. But that was exactly why this ghetto grandma existed, to torture rotten rascals until they were made right. With that, Luke created the rehab center, and since he didn't know how effective the center would be, he decided to try placing 5 remorseful-looking prisoners first. Seeing the young men made Granny Nema excited because it had been centuries since she last got laid. Luke hoped the center would actually solve the problem with the thieves, but when they started looking at him with puppy dog eyes, he was almost deceived, thinking that they had changed their ways already. Luckily, he checked the village loyalty points for them and found that they were miles away from being loyal, so he permitted Granny Nema to take them and use them as she seemed fit. Next, he took it upon himself to fix the gate that was damaged by the bandit and upgrade it for improved security. When he was done, he explored this to see what new features were available, knowing that he had agreed to level 5, and then he found out that he could remodel facilities into new shapes and change their colors. This made him look at the grand architecture of his village, but even that was enough to make him smile because he was proud of his achievements. After thinking for a while about what to build next, he finally decided to create a public bath. The villages were completely lost, so he had to explain that they could all use the public bath to shower, but there were dedicated sections for men and women. One lady was asking dumb questions, so he said if she needed specific instructions on how to bathe there, he could give her up close and personal tutorials in the bathroom. He showed the ladies the dressing room and wasted no time in flinging their clothes and revealing those French curves. He went to check in on the men who invited him to join them and take a dip so they could dip into his rear pit. Seeing everyone really having fun made him so happy, but his smile slowly disappeared when he heard that they were doing absolute nasty stuff right behind him. Much later, Celen and others were into rigorous training, but she kept breaking the swords and making them feel like the weak irredeemable simps they were. But this made them realize that they didn't have actual weapons, and this was making them hold back. Unfortunately, in a real battle, there would be no holding back, just as it was in the battle against the bandit where the villagers' shields were broken easily. They planned to go further on exploration to get better training items and realized that in the absence of real weapons, they couldn't explore the forest safely. So he checked to see if he could get some weapons from his system, but all he saw were facilities, and when Barlat saw just how concerned he looked, he told Luke not to worry and try using his gift, mostly for himself, because they were way too dependent on him. It was at that moment he found his true love. One of the guys said it was true because Luke was busy being more than living in a lame farmer's shed. But instead of upgrading his house, he chose to build a bath for them first. The dude felt it was inconveniencing that Luke, Milia, and Celen had to share a bed, but he didn't know Luke was really enjoying poking multiple holes at a time. And the other creepy dudes caught on to that quickly, realizing that Luke was the direct opposite of innocent. To shut the loud mouths up, Luke quickly upgraded his house to a medium-sized one, while Celen and Milia made the goats regret letting their fat mouths leak. After creating his house, Luke ushered the ladies in, gladly saying they now had 3 rooms. But Milia wasn't pleased that one of the rooms had a bigger bed than the other 2, so he apologized that it was an upgrade fault, and she said he could have the bed as the village head that he was. The twist was that she'd share the bed with him because she couldn't get used to sleeping on any other bed. But this wasn't so exciting to Celen, and she protested the unfairness. To calm the situation, Luke said they could both share the bed because he could manage a really tiny bed. This was the worst news for both girls, and they both mourned having to spend a second with each other. But he ignored them and went on to customize the wall, transforming it into a stone wall. He also added some stairs behind it, about 8 sets of them. Next, he created holes in the wall from which the villagers could attack intruders. But when he inspected what he'd created, it was far deeper than he thought it'd be, meaning they might have to use spears. To his dismay, he saw Dongda's fat, scary-looking face from the top of the wall, and the man asked him what the space was supposed to be used for. Luke said they could use the windows to strike back if they were ever under attack, but he wasn't sure which weapon would be suitable for such a space. But Dogen had a hand fetish, so he started rubbing Luke's hands from the hole and sharing his boring sand castle stories from his childhood. This made Luke realize that the space was too accessible from the outside, so he started thinking deeply about how to make the villagers more capable of defending themselves with weapons. Unfortunately, their village was in the middle of nowhere, and even if they searched for small villages nearby, Luke wasn't sure they'd be able to help his village with the required weapons. But an idea suddenly occurred to him, and he realized that if he used his facility customization skill, he could alter a part of the wall. With that, he pulled out a log of wood and carved a sword out of it. Then he added a couple of touches here and there, making it a lot better. However, that sword had no handle and the system wasn't letting him customize it anymore. So he figured that it was so because the sword was detached from the log of wood in the wall. The next time he tried carving a sword, he left it attached at the base of the wood and the system let him customize it this time around. So he created a handle. He was really proud of his handwork, which only cost about 3 points, so he proceeded to make a bunch of them, but right then, his rubber sword snapped and he realized just how fragile it was. His dumb, rusty brain accepted that wood wasn't the best material to create a sword out of, but he wasn't quite sure where he could get a sturdier material for the sword. It was at that moment it occurred to him that he'd completely forgotten about the prison, which consisted of metallic bars. But when he got in, those dudes just wanted a taste of his innocent meat. He was sort of terrified making it in front of them, but since he noticed that the bars were super sturdy, he decided to create a weapon out of them. He ignored those yapping fools and continued with his work. So he started by creating an extra bar among the rails, and then he began customizing the bar, much to the awe of the noisy prisoners. When he finished, he was pleased with the products and decided to seek the advice of those who'd know about weapons. He first showed it to Celen and Barlat, who were surprised that he made an iron sword, and even more surprised that it was his village building skill that allowed him that opportunity. She quickly threw a sword to Barlat, and they sparred for a while, after which she satisfactorily concluded that the swords were perfect. Excitedly, she ran to tell the others that Luke had created weapons for them, while Grandma Nema paid Luke a visit, looking like she was ready to join the ancestors. But right behind she pointed to the newly reformed thugs, who now looked like they dropped straight from the heavens. Luke was still super scared that these guys could surprise him with a punch to the face, so he checked the system to assess their village loyalty, and much to his surprise, they had a high village loyalty score. Next, Grandma commanded the boys to obey Luke, who's the village chief, and they should get ready to swallow his pipe or die if he commands them to. They immediately bowed and pledged their allegiance to him, telling him to order them as soon as he wished. Luke asked Granny what she did to transform them into such loyal beings, but she said the facility made them docile as soon as they were put in, so she didn't even have the opportunity to drill holes through them as she would have wanted. As she turned to leave, she asked him to send more difficult men next time, but now was stuck with these obsessed boys. He was in a confused state because he didn't know what to do with them given that they were highly loyal, and the granny attested to their changing attitude. This didn't stop him from suspecting whether they were safe the moment he saw Barlat's sword training. He told him to all go and help him out. Granny kept rehabilitating the thieves, and all her reformed boys were tracked by other villagers for a while and seen to remain in good character. Later, Luke visited jail with Grandma, who was up to his usual antics, but he suddenly heard a voice and turned to look around, but he saw no one. It wasn't until he turned to see someone in a cell and found the guy with the gift of telepathy. The boy said his name was Satine, and he was a member of a well-known merchant family, but he was kicked out when he messed up, and this forced him to become a thief so he could survive. He continued, saying he had only been surviving through copying others, and it wasn't that he really enjoyed being a thug, so he was really fed up because he'd done terrible things. Luke seemed to understand the guy, so when Satine swore that he'd atone for his sins if Luke would just let him out, it was surprising that he didn't budge because the system said Satine was still rebellious. However, Satine still insisted that he had learned his lesson, but Luke wasn't even moved, and this angered Satine. Satine was already getting pissed because he couldn't focus well with so many voices around him, so he decided he was going to find some information to make Luke weak. Right then, Milia walked in with her nasty thoughts that terrified the heck out of Satine, so he just had to call her out for being nasty. Milia was confused and thought he was being rude, but Grandma calmly explained that Satine had the ability to read people's minds. Immediately, Milia told Granny Nema that Satine was willing to be rehabilitated quickly, so the old lady dragged his wretched buns out of the cell. Just as Milia turned to leave, Luke asked her what she was thinking, but she said there was nothing, only that she was thinking about cleaning toilets, which must have come off as nasty to Satine. Luke bought her silly story, so that was the end of it. Much later, the villagers were all gossiping and Luke realized that something wasn't right, so he went to ask them what had happened and unfortunately found out that the hunting team hadn't arrived yet. This was even more terrifying because they usually arrived at a certain time, but hours had gone by really fast and there was barely any sign of them. Suddenly one villager said it was the curse of a certain Almiraj, which was a giant aggressive rabbit with soft meat. Now Luke felt it could be hard to capture if one did have a gift for hunting. But he did not feel the rabbit had any magical powers. Just then the girl brought out some rabbit's meatballs which she'd been secretly massaging herself with, and she handed them to Luke and Burlet. However, she said they weren't regular balls, and then began narrating a story that started 1 week when the hunters returned with the giant rabbit as usual. As she stared into its eyes, she felt chills all over her, and even though this animal was supposed to be dead, she could feel it staring right at the balls in her hands. As she drew closer to confirm her fears, the rabbit resurrected and started screaming until it came on her. The girl, after narrating her story, started going crazy and throwing the meatballs at Luke and Burlet, and after, they resumed trying to know what might have happened to the hunters. It was then Burlet realized that they might have gotten some of the wild rabbits sent on themselves and accidentally attracted the animals, meaning they could currently have been surrounded by the creepy rabbits. At that instant, Luke felt a chilly sensation and said they should go and assist the hunters, but suddenly someone from the watchtower alerted them that something was approaching. They climbed the stairs on the wall and saw 2 shiny balls in the center, which had a striking familiarity with those in the girl's hands. While they were faced with this odd entity, Luke got into defensive mode, and since he was the closest thing to a fighter in the village, he told Burlet to get everyone to safety, and one villager even suggested that they sacrifice the reformed prisoners to the giant twin balls. But suddenly Celen showed up and demanded an explanation for what was going on. Luke turned and was glad to see Celen, while Burlet explained that they had just seen a giant creature and were preparing for an apocalypse. But then the hunting team revealed that they found a couple of giant orcs and hunted them down, and that was probably what had terrified the villagers earlier. In their country, orcs were regarded as delicacies because they were extremely rare and the meat was so sweet everyone would want to eat it out for hours. There were 2 orcs and the villagers were already drooling for the orc's meat, so Milia and her siblings came with their axes to butcher it. Watching them do the deed with a dead orc, Luke wanted to puke. But after a while, the orc's meat was ready for him to dig into. It looked so delicious that one user even wanted to sell it, but with just 1 bite, the guy did 1 million backflips. Next, they forced the meat into Luke's mouth, and only 1 bite was enough to take him to all the continents and back. In his lifetime, Luke had never tasted that good orc, but on the other hand, the rabbit meatball girl looked like the world was crashing down on her. She was just upset that it wasn't the curse of the meatballs as she'd claimed. But just then Milia walked in with steaming hot orcish ball broil. Luke asked why she made it, and she shared that it was a nutritious recipe she occasionally made at the castle because his dad really enjoyed her meatball sauce. Anyway, this was good news for Rabbit Girl, who was somewhat excited, and so Milia told everyone to dig into the meal. It was indeed delicious, and the girl was really digging it because the outside was hard and the inside was juicy. What tasted even better was the orc soup, and that virgin was really enjoying her first taste of real orc meat. So far, half a year has passed since Luke created the village, so the villagers started preparing for winter. However, Burlet came with some others, saying that they planned to return to the village for a bit because they were concerned about their aging parents, so about 5 of them would be going. Luke told them they could even bring their parents over to the village, but Burlet, although he was sure the old people wouldn't survive the trip down there. Celen and Barlat offered to escort them, but Luke said he couldn't send the entire hunting team to serve as bouncers. But suddenly some voices chipped in, offering to help. Those voices belonged to the reformed group of guys that no one wanted to hang with, who said they were more than willing to die protecting the others. Luke wasn't sure it was safe to let them out of the village just yet, but Celen said they could come along to serve as extra hands, and if they attempted any form of betrayal, she was enough to beat them up. After that, she bid them goodbye and they did the same. Also, no one was really pleased that those reformed thieves were headed out because they couldn't trust them yet. But Luke seemed to have an idea of what to do. Days after that, Luke made a few more adjustments to his village, which successfully allowed him to create double stone walls in the village, with a space in between serving as a living space for the reformed thieves. He felt that would be enough to make the villagers feel at ease while the reformed dudes helped to work the fields and do all that. When they saw the space allocated to them, the guys were all thankful, including the telepathy dude. They also promised to be on the lookout for potential threats or dangers, while Satine said he'd communicate any of such via his telepathy technique. When Dogen heard about his gift, he was gushing all over Satine and digging him already. However, he was concerned that the guy had such a gift and still ended up being a thief. Again, Satine had to recount how he was kicked out of his wealthy family. It all started the very day. He was blessed with the gift of telepathy, which was considered a very useless gift. The priest was no priest at all and had the nastiest things running through his mind. So, from the look on the boy's face, he knew that Satine was hearing his nasty thoughts. Now the thing was, Satine actually knew way too much about so many people, like the evil priest who was secretly beating his slaves, an innocent-looking farmer who was poisoning his boss, and a saintly-looking girl who was secretly Mia Khalifa's apprentice. Everyone disliked Satine because they know he'd be hearing their thoughts, and even his parents, whom he loved and trusted so much, had their own secret misgivings about him and felt she was a shame and a disappointment to the family. So they secretly decided to get rid of him since he knew everything they were up to anyway. Afterward, he ran away and found the gang leader, who took him in after realizing the potential Satine's gift had, and the other gang members were equally welcoming. Even after hearing his pitiful story, one of the villagers said Satine had no right to harm others just because he wasn't loved at home, and the boy accepted this. The same villager was about to turn Satine into a laundry boy when Milia walked in cheerfully, announcing to Luke that Burlet and the others were back and all in one piece. But while she was talking so innocently, her nasty thoughts as usual made Satine pass out. Much later, Burlet and Barlat arrived with their old father, who recognized Luke as the village head and shared that his son spoke so much about Luke's goodness, so he came to thank him personally. Another person who returned safely was Grandma Nema's husband, but as soon as he tried touching her, she told him to take his wrinkled hands off her, because all she needed was fresh young men. Luke, on the other hand, was secretly hoping for the safety of the other villagers in Barlat's hometown when he spotted Celen with some young men wearing a familiar uniform. She told him that they were shovs, and to be specific, the remnants of the gang of thieves that they'd caught and reformed. One of the reformed dudes tapped his reformed comrade and told him he'd soon see the light. But that dude was shocked because his friend would never usually speak like that. However, he continued by saying he and the reformies had learned the value of living a just life. While all this was going on, thousands of miles away were a man and his son who were looking battered and defeated by the elements, tired of walking aimlessly in pursuit of a village. The son told his dad there wasn't hope of finding any soon, but the man insisted on going open because they had no better option, since they were out of food and water. At one point, the father was really upset about how terrible things were back in his village, with raised taxes and a terrible harvest. They were out there looking for Luke, but the man's son felt Luke was way too young when he was kicked out and would either be dead or in a different land. With everything looking so bleak, the man's son regretted being born in a useless village, because if he'd left as a young man, he'd have been an adventurer at least and had a much better life. But his endless whining really pissed his father off, and the man took out all his frustrations on the boy while pointing out that his son was probably too much of a wimp to have been an adventurer. He also insulted the boy for having no better idea than the one he offered. But while he kept nagging, the boy spotted something in the distance and pointed his dad in the direction. However, the old man felt his boy was trying to change the subject, but the boy insisted that there was a stone wall far ahead. His dad had a blind man's vision, so the boy climbed over a rock to prove that he was really seeing a village. When he peeped in, the villagers all seemed to be living harmoniously, and Luke, Milia, and Celen were taking in just how happy their people looked. Right then, Luke was feeling drowsy, so he went off to bed and fell asleep in his own bed. But the girls later snuck in, snuggled into his bed, and placed him right in the middle of the sandwich. The next morning, Luke suddenly got a message from Satine that two men were approaching the village and were probably refugees. Later on, the man, named Mac, introduced himself as the chief of a southern village and said his son was named Manta. Luke introduced himself as like the village head, but he secretly wondered if those two were from his village. However, they beat him to it and asked if he was the son of Lord Albert, and Luke was shocked that the man knew him. Even worse, Mac confirmed that he knew Luke was sent away by his father to cultivate a vast wasteland. Out seemed like Luke had been at it for ages, but the boy said it was actually half a year. This made both man and son suspicious because it was essentially impossible to have created such a civilization in half a year, except if Lord Albert had already built the city. Anyway, Luke asked them what brought them, so Mac explained that there was an incoming war, so they were looking for some place to earn money during the winter. Gladly, Luke welcomed them, and they were surprised that he didn't even hesitate. But this made Luke think deeply about the war, and he suspected it must be one of the 5 powerful families who are usually beefing with his own family, and he also wondered if his brother Raoul would be joining the fight. Anyway, Mac and Manta thanked Luke, with Mac saying he wasn't used to such kindles because other nobles abandoned the light of their people. Manta warned his dad to watch his mouth, so Mac apologized for getting carried away. Meanwhile, Luke was deep in thought, wondering about what life would have been like if he'd received the gift of holy swordsmanship. He wondered if he would have noticed the suffering of everyone else around him, because back then he was eager to live up to his father's expectations. Mac and his son decided to head back to the village to give everyone the good news, while Luke said there would be more than enough food for everyone. A couple of days later, the villagers arrived, and Luke welcomed them. Seeing the healthy crops in the village, Manta said the Dumas about Luke getting a dumb gift were all false, but Luke confirmed that he actually didn't receive the gift of holy showmanship and was ordered to cultivate a wasteland. He also added that he received the gift of village building and wasn't able to use it back at the village, but it was with his current gift that he built this village. Just then the hunters returned and were holding another set of giant rabbits, surprising the new villagers. Celen welcomed them and shared that they were about to have a feast, but Luke wondered why she was boasting when she'd done way more than that before. It was then she pointed them to a great boar, which was part of the hunted meat they returned with, and that was even more of a shocker. Even Luke asked how she took it down, so she said it was a team effort, all thanks to the weapons Luke made for them. This made the hunters also realize that they'd gotten a lot stronger. Anyway, they started dragging the boar, and Luke told Mac and the other villagers to wait while the feast would begin shortly. They asked if they could set up a tent, but Luke suddenly remembered that he hadn't set up anything for them. However, Mac told Luke they could handle themselves since they mostly just wanted to earn some money, but before his very own eyes, Luke caused a building to appear from nowhere and they were super duper shocked. Anyway, Luke shared that it was his gift of village building that made it possible, and even though it had some limitations, he could do so much with it. Mac said everyone else might have thought Luke's gift was a useless one, but it turned out to be more useful than their imaginations could create. After all this while, Luke had successfully exceeded 1,000 villagers and was at village level 6, much to his own surprise. It turns out that more people from his village trooped in, and after them, a handful of starved refugees came in asking for help, so Luke welcomed them as usual. He also opened the gates for those who'd simply come to look for money and for those who felt he was running free Airbnbs. Luke felt the recent influx of people may have been because the reformed thieves were always on patrol to prevent travelers from getting harmed, so they might have been a link. Later, Luke and other figureheads discussed on their village was growing by the minute and that they were trending everywhere. Unfortunately, the war was also getting worse, and Celen pointed out that they might be the next targets, but she and Milia were equal to the task. Just then it clicked to Luke that gifts were great to have, so if even 10% of the village population had powers, it'd be enough for them. He later assessed them and found that there were about 100 people who had potential gifts of diverse types. Out of these, 19 of them had battle-related gifts, and when word was out, those 2 slackers were glad they didn't have to work anymore. However, Burlet dragged them from behind to remind them that everyone's effort was needed to keep the village running. Currency in the village didn't provide for many kinds of jobs, so not everyone got their recommended job, but instead got similar jobs to their recommended ones. Luke prayed for things to stay good, but he had concerns, such as people's village loyalty score being very low, and the lower the village loyalty, the higher the chances of leaving the village. One particular guy surprisingly had a low score, but seemed to be getting along with everyone. However, he had more riz than Aaron Pierre, so all the ladies were fighting for him, even though he was married with a child. Eventually, the dude caved into pressure and was about to cheat on his wife when a mysterious hand held his hands in the middle of the night. The hand of justice was none other than Grandma Nemas, who was following an approach to prevent the village loyalty score from dropping further and leading to a depraved society. Sometimes Luke had to personally intervene in some people's affairs to help deal with their problems, but that wore him out. Burlet encouraged him that things would get the village, even though they were currently tense. Anyway, know that the villager population had the 1,000 mark. Luke had the option of building underground tunnels, shops, a castle gate, training grounds, and apartment complexes. From the civilization and memories of his past life, apartments were quite normal, and with more than 20 living spaces, they were more valuable than the roadhouses she was building because everyone would have a bathroom and a toilet. The only problem was that it cost him 300 points to make it. While he was deep in thought about developing the village, the old woman passed by in a somewhat fatigued state. so Luke ran to find out what was wrong. She shared that so far how rehabilitation program had been going well, but there were two of the thieves who weren't budging. One of them was the gang boss, Doriel, to any form of torture. The woman felt he was so used to death and had developed serious guts because of that, but Grandma was ready to take up the challenge over and over again. However, her main problem was the second thief who wouldn't budge and was none other than Bar, the first guy they caught. When they visited him again, he was so pissed and irritated by their little bratty selves. He, however, just called Granny an old hag and reminded her that nothing she'd ever do would make him change. She angrily swore to send him to an early grave, but this seemed to be making him so happy that he made happy noises. Luke was surprised at the sound he was making, but Bar told him to shut up because no one could get him to flinch. However, the old woman didn't let him finish talking and began whipping the hell out of him, but it seemed every single lash was only making him erupt in his pants, and it was as clear as daylight that Bar was into anything that slapped him and gagged him. Will they find a way to crack the cultured fool? And are Luke's parents ever going to learn that their son wasn't the absolute failure they thought he was? If you'd like to find out in part 2, comment, "Choke me, Grandma." Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.